then after it starts melting, I put more orange juice, and it's delicious. It's cold.
Ooh, I like it. I like it. Okay, are you ready for this?
Are you going to record or just?
I'm going to record so that it transcribes the interview for me. But here. So this is for my human rights and justice class. And so to start off with, can you tell me a bit about who you are?
Okay, I am your grandfather.
Okay.
And I'm 81,
Mm-hmm.
but my attitude is 21. So
can you tell me a bit about like where you grew up and where you live now?
Yeah. So I grew up in Cuba,
Mm-hmm.
and I had a fantastic environment growing up. And I had one brother and 11 cousins. And my life, I would say, wouldn't be the same without counting with the farm of our grandfather. And we were very close, all the cousins. So I have wonderful memories. And then I went to a Jesuit high school in Cuba, in Havana, called Belen High School, like Bethlehem. And I studied there from first grade to 12th year senior year high school, which was 5 years of high school and 7 of grade school. So I was there 12 years.
Wow.
With the Jesuits, and that had a big impact in my life, especially from the standpoint of social justice. So once we came to the United States, I had to adapt to the new way of life. I already had studied 3 years of economics at the Catholic University of Villanova, the same as the priest in Philadelphia, Augustinians. And then once I came to the United States in Atlanta, I finished my college education and graduated in 1965. I left Cuba in 1960. And our first daughter, Ellie, was born in Atlanta. And the pictures of my graduation from college, I had the cap and gown holding baby Ellie.
Aww.
She was 3 months old.
Oh, wow.
So I was fortunate to marry my sweetheart, Eloisa. We call her Ellie. And I met her and her family when she was 12.
Wow.
But we started dating when she was 16. And then I left Cuba in 1960, and her and her family of 14 brothers and sisters left after an invasion in 61. But since her father was dean of chemical engineering at Villanova University, they were caught prisoners the day of the invasion. So she and 2 sisters were in prison for about 2 months. And her father about 3 months. And then they had to leave Cuba right away because they told their father, you stay, they're going to put him in prison. And the reason that the communists hated him was because he was a firm believer in democracy. And he founded in Cuba, it was not a political party, it was an ideological group called Democracia Orgánica Cristiana, Christian Organic Democracy. And I remember being in college, I used to go to the lectures or gatherings, they were informal gatherings, about the social doctrine of the church. and everything related with social justice. So I was going to their house to these charlas or get-togethers before I even started dating Ellie. So I remember her growing up.
Yeah.
And then we finally got married in 1964. And God bless us with 5 children. Wow. Ellie, Rosie, your mother, Manny, Bibi, and Patrick. So we really have been very blessed.
And then you've stayed the rest of your life in the U.S. and now have been living in Miami for how many years?
Since 1980.
Wow.
So we lived 9 years in Virginia, 6.5 years in Chicago, and then in Miami since 1980.
Wow. And so going back to your life in Cuba, and when was your first time thinking about like right and wrong and what justice was as a kid?
I would say as a kid, I would say since before entering high school, I was already with that orientation, and mainly because of the education with the Jesuit priest. And then once I was in a junior and senior year, we were very involved in social justice. And for instance, when I was in junior and senior high school, a group of us volunteered to teach workers at night, and they were mainly unskilled work, carpenters, painters, bricklayers, and we taught them to pass the entrance examination to the Belen Vocational School. And there they study electricity, air conditioning, radio, television. And by the time they graduated, they were ready to have a very productive life, even though they came from families from very low income and they were poor. So for us, it was very remunerating to help these guys. And it really helped us. And then the big thing that our class of 1957 did, with the idealism of helping not only the poor but the uneducated, we decided to do a project. And the project was to build a small clinic in one of the poorest neighborhoods of Miami, of Cuba. And I remember it was called La Lisa, but the area where we built the clinic was so bad that they called it Korea.
Oh, wow.
And we used to go there sometimes after school or on weekends to physically build the clinic.
Wow.
I remember using the brick and mortar under the supervision of an architect from the Agrupación Católica Universitaria. And then once the clinic was completed, like in 1959, doctors from the ACU, the Agrupación Católica, were doing volunteer work as doctors in the clinic in one of the poorest neighborhoods.
Wow.
So thanks to the ACU, which was a Jesuit organization that have had a tremendous impact in my life, I was really involved in social justice.
And when did you start thinking about human rights in general?
I would say since I was at the beginning of high school, or what age is that?
Like 14, 15?
Yeah.
And what got you thinking about it? What inspired you to start thinking about it?
I would say the Jesuit education, but not everybody at that age got involved like that.
Mm-hmm.
Other people were more involved in sports, but for me, it was like a vocation.
Mm-hmm. So, what does human rights mean to you now?
Well, I would say mainly justice.
Mm.
Uh, and then I would say trying to live the the Gospels
Mm-hmm.
and apply it to daily life
Mm.
and our relation with our peers and with people that we can help
Mm-hmm.
and especially have an impact in society
Mm.
and not only help others but give a good example teaching social justice, which is taking care of each other
Mm-hmm.
in a very, very positive way.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. And so, what impact do you think your family had on your ideas of justice?
I would say, remember, I come from the generation of the 40s
Mm-hmm.
and 50s.
Mm-hmm.
So I was born in 39. My father and mother were great people, but they were in a different environment
Mm-hmm.
than my brother and I
Mm-hmm.
that spent
Mm-hmm.
12 years with the Jesuits.
Mm-hmm.
So, thanks God, they enrolled us
Mm-hmm.
in Balearian school. And they were hard workers, very good parents, but I don't think they had that inquietud. How
Mm-hmm.
would you say that? Uh,
What's another word for it? Um,
uh, like the vocation of
yeah.
socialism. They taught us about it, but
Mm-hmm.
it was a different
Yeah.
environment. So uh, uh, the fact that once I studied high school and college in Cuba, it really helped me to put in practice
Mm.
what I had learned in theory.
Yeah. And so you talk about how the Jesuits have a very big impact. Your family, a little bit. But how did history? So you're talking about you're growing up in the 40s. This is a time where the Holocaust was happening in Europe and World War II. And then in the 50s, at the end of the 50s, we have the Cuban Revolution. So how did history impact your perception of human rights?
Well, something very interesting. My father was a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
He was a research chemist. And he loved history
Mm-hmm.
and astronomy.
Mm-hmm.
And every night, I remember he used to listen shortwave radio,
Mm-hmm.
mainly the BBC of London.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up uh, with and this is a correction. My father was very intellectual
Mm-hmm.
and he loved history. So in a way, yes, I was educated in that environment. So I even remember when I was little and President Roosevelt died,
Mm-hmm.
I think 1945,
Mm-hmm.
so I was 6 years old. And I remember perfectly when we were listening to the radio, the BBC in London, and they announced that President Roosevelt had died.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, thanks to my father and mother, I kept up
Mm-hmm.
what was going in the world.
And so, relating to what was going on in the world and human rights, did you, when you were younger, did you connect the two of looking at what was going on and putting it in the perspective of human rights, or had that not been as much?
I would say yes, and I'll give you an example. Uh, when I was like in second year of high school, I had that, uh, I said the word inquietud again, which
Mm-hmm.
means like a desire, a
Mm-hmm.
wish
Mm-hmm.
to connect with the workers.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that one day I wanted to spend a whole day with the man in charge of the farm.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked him, Antonio, whenever you're ready, I want to wake up at the time you wake up at 5 in the morning, go and milk the cows, and spend a whole day with Antonio, who was a campesino, a farmer. And for me, it was an eye opener to live a whole day like they live. And that had a big impact.
Wow. And so that's beautiful. And so when was the first time, or when were some of the early times in your life that you remember witnessing an injustice, something that you felt was someone's rights were being violated?
I would say in Cuba, the way that there was racism regarding the black people and the poor people, unfortunately, and here in America, they think of Cuba as a fun place. And the tourists going to Havana a weekend to spend it in the nightclubs, have fun. And that's the way they remember Cuba. And actually, it wasn't Cuba, it was only Havana. So there was politically, since the early 40s, a lot of lack of political stability. So there were many injustices. And I remember during the dictatorship of Batista, the one that overthrew President Carlos Pérez Carras, who was the last president elected democratically in 1948. And in 1952, Batista was military, a general. He overthrew the democratic government. So I remember about the injustices that going through the central road from Havana to a farm, you could see very nice houses that Batista's government had built next to the road. So people would say, oh, he cared for the poor. And there were nice little houses made of brick. And but that was publicity. Because behind that, there were very poor people living in very bad human conditions. So here was a government bragging that they took care of the poor and the uneducated, but it was just political propaganda.
Wow.
And then the environment that there was in Cuba during the Batista regime, which was a very bad dictatorship, right wing, sociologically caused that Fidel Castro started a revolution with communist ideas that then he implemented in Cuba as of December 31st, 1958. So he started the communist government in January 1, 1959, and he insisted that he was not communist. He used to say the revolution is as green as the palm trees instead of red, like communism.
Interesting.
But he was brainwashing the people, and eventually he said, I have been a communist, I am the communist, and I would keep being a communist for the rest of my life. And he died at age 90.
Wow. And what were some of the injustices you witnessed under Fidel Castro's regime?
Lack of human rights. It was a very leftist communist revolution. And only the people that were fanatic of Fidel Castro had a good life. And anybody that didn't agree with him and the environment started growing up against the Castro regime, then you were considered like an enemy. of the revolution.
Mm.
So there was a tremendous brainwash that if you were not with him, you were against him. Even if you were not against, just you were not with. So that created a disbalance in society.
And did you ever feel like your human rights were violated?
Yes. I got involved with the Christian Democratic Party when things started going bad. So it was really not a party. It was Movimiento Demócrata Cristiano, Christian Democracy, which I was inspired by Elliot's father, Manolo, the dean of the university. So, since I was very involved in this group, that was an ideological group, I felt that I was being, what would be the word, seen as against Castro and against the human rights that he said that he was protecting. But since it was a leftist dictatorship, he bragged about that he was inspiring human rights. But really, no. Everybody that was not with him was considered against him. So we all suffer the consequences.
And so I know there's a story about your house being searched. Do you think that was where do you think that fits into human rights?
Yes. When I realized, and this is like a parenthesis, when I realized that the democracy movement wasn't working because Fidel was getting more and more communist, and there was no chance for democracy to prevail. Then I started working with a group of students that had a group called Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil. The reason for the word revolucionario was that the environment of idealistic college students was that the so-called revolution that Castro promoted was stolen. Like he had promised to reestablish democracy after the Batista dictatorship, to have free elections, that the last elections were in 48. And here in 59, he was promising free elections, and people loved it. So that's the reason at the beginning, I would say 85% of the population liked Fidel, because between democracy, free elections, no regulation of the media, and especially he was lying about him doing social justice. It was all the contrary. And when he quote won the revolution, he stole the revolution. But as they were going toward Havana from the Oriente, the eastern province where he started the revolution in the mountains, as they were advancing toward Havana, later on I found out they were killing soldiers from the Batista regime who were poor people, peasants that were in the army, and they were being shot in firing squads. So before he arrived to Havana, like triumphalism, they were already violating human rights. So they were saying that they were pro-human rights, but they were even killing people that didn't agree with them. So back to your question, after I realized that the democratic process wasn't ready to be implemented at that time, and I tried to.
Mm-hmm.
Then I started helping this group that became an underground organization to try to overthrow the Castro regime. Then this student group was like a satellite of a bigger group called Movimiento de Recuperación Revolucionaria, the movement to recover the revolution. So since the revolution promised so many great things, they were treasoners. They treasoned the revolution. So then from that group, it was decided by the underground in connection with the U.S. government to form training camps in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and another country in Central America to train mainly students and young people. And the CIA supervised those training camps to prepare an invasion to rescue democracy. And unfortunately, due to many international political pressures, the invasion failed. But there were, when we left Cuba in 1960, my parents and I, there was such an environment that the Castro regime was going to collapse that I remember when I left on November 14, 1960, that we thought we'll be back in 3 to 6 months because of the invasion. And we had the mentality that since the U.S. was only 90 miles from Cuba, they would not allow a communist country 90 miles from Key West. And like I said, due to international pressures, the invasion failed. And then there was more repression. So from 1961 on, then came the missile crisis, and the war was close to World War III. So it was that bad. But everything started with the degradation of human rights.
And so you talked about human rights in Cuba being violated, and your own wife was put in prison at the age of, how old was she?
17.
17, she was put in prison. How did that shape your idea of human rights in Cuba?
That there was a minority of intellectuals, and mainly Catholic intellectuals, that they wanted to correct the situation in Cuba, and especially the inequalities. There were tremendous inequalities between Havana, which people considered the entire Cuba was like that, and all the injustices and lack of balance sociologically and politically and economically in the rest of Cuba. So people thought Cuba was the same as Havana, and it wasn't. Havana was like a separate territory that gave the impression to the world that it was a great country when the rest of the country was having injustices.
Wow. And so then later on, when you were helping support the CIA for the Bay of Pigs, how did your concept of human rights change of looking at the U.S. when you saw the way you worked, the way the CIA worked?
Well, I would say they were acting also as dictators. One of the biggest mistakes that are all the different groups that were trying to overthrow Castro's government, all of them were under the umbrella of what was called Frente Revolucionario Democrático. And I became the delegate of the student group to that organization. And we used to meet every week or every 10 days with the person that had been chosen by all organizations to become the provisional president of Cuba, assuming that the invasion was going to win. His name was Dr. Miro Cardona. He was a very respected judge and professor of law professor at the university. So he was supposed to become the provisional president of Cuba. So we rely a lot on the CIA. We were taking orders from him for them. And in a way, looking backwards, we were almost like slaves or victims of the CIA. And whatever they say, we have to comply. And then I remember the day the invasion failed, they all cut off communications with the different groups. You would call by telephone to the specific person from the CIA that was your connection. The telephones were unanswered for about 5 days to a week. So all of a sudden, we were so dependent on them, and then they drop us. So that was a big injustice.
Yeah.
But at the same time was the fault of the Cubans that became so dependent on the CIA. And then to make things worse, the different groups in Miami that had underground people in Cuba, the CIA divided us. So each group had a different contact from the CIA. And I would say it was a lack of respect to the Cubans, especially young Cubans that were sacrificing themselves and their families, going to Central America to be trained as soldiers. And they were too young. There was an injustice too. But it's interesting. They divided us, the groups in Miami. So each one had a CIA contact. And sometimes they were giving us contradictory instructions. So they were dividing us. At the same time, we're depending on them. And even economically, they were financing the revolutionaries Castro. So they controlled the boats that were taking people from Miami to Cuba in the underground. And it was sad. Young people, 18, 20 years old, friends of mine that were taken in small boats or what we call lanchas, and were taken to the underground. And I felt that they were really making an injustice with all these young people. And eventually I have been at one point, the leaders of the student group in Miami, they said there are only two choices for the young men, either to go to Cuba to the underground or to go to the training camps. So I remember having gone to a trailer in front of the immigration building in downtown Miami to register as a volunteer to go to the training camps. But with my personality, I couldn't have been in an army and killing people. So that was against my my beliefs. So I couldn't imagine shooting people even in a war. So fortunately, God permitted that they named me the coordinator of the group in Miami, while all the other people either went to the underground or went to the training camps. So I was one of the few men that stayed in Miami, and we had a lot of young ladies that were our friends helping in the office of the student group with propaganda and maintaining an activism. And I remember that I used to go 2 or 3 times a week to a radio station in Coral Gables, which is a neighborhood in Miami, very affluent. And we used to go to a radio station that signed off from the air at midnight. And then they let us record speeches and pro-democracy propaganda. And the CIA took those tapes to a small island east of Costa Rica called Swam Island. So the CIA had radio equipment and antennas transmitting to Cuba of what we had recorded in Miami. And they made believe people in Cuba that we were talking from inside Cuba, but we were transmitting from Coral Gables, Miami, Florida. Wow. So we were living in a very artificial environment. And looking backwards, I feel that we became like slaves. Wow. Of the CIA.
Interesting. And so now flashing forward to the present day and the past 4 years under Trump, how do you think your ideas of human rights have changed?
That we need more human rights. And let me backtrack a little.
Yeah.
When I was 7 years old, in 1946, I made the first trip to the United States with my parents and my brother. And I remember we were on vacation to the mountains in North Carolina. Then we visited Washington, New York. But I couldn't believe in 1946 the social injustices that were happening in USA. And I remember as a 7-year-old boy, if we stopped in an area to get gas and restaurant and all that, I was so disappointed with the life here in USA in 1946, especially racial injustices. So there was a restaurant for white men and black men, white women and black women, even the water coolers, black and white. So when as tourists we thought that America was the greatest, America was already still suffering of slavery. And the generations of black people in the 40s and 50s, their human rights were not recognized. So there was a lot of racism, also in the workplace and in society. They were always put down. So I'm connecting this with Trump in the sense that Trump, in a way, reminds me of Fidel Castro because he promised great things during the political campaign in 2015. Once he became president, he started dividing the country. And the same thing, you either were pro-Trump or against Trump. And that really divided the nation. And then areas like not as much as Ku Klux Klan, but white supremacists. They grew up under the protection of the Trump administration. And a lot of injustices start getting deeper and deeper. So on one hand, and that's the reason I said it reminds me of Fidel Castro, he promised a lot of good things during the campaign, but during his 4 years as president, he divided the country, and we ended up with the quasi-revolution that happened at the Capitol on January 6th, that it ended like a revolution in the U.S. Capitol. And it caused the deaths of 5 Americans. I believe 4 of them policemen. And 2 of them committed suicide. So they were so frustrated with what was happening. So, unfortunately, like I said, Trump became a dictator. And that's against the Constitution and against the Founding Fathers to have in the year 2020 a true dictator against the principles that we learned from Lincoln and the Founding Fathers.
And do you think that, have you ever felt like your human rights in the U.S. were violated? You talked about it in Cuba, but do you, since leaving Cuba?
Mine personally, no. I was able to live a normal life. I'm a family man, and with my work in executive positions. So I don't think that directly it affected me, but it affected the society around me. So I was very conscious of, in a way, the violation of human rights that were happening during the Trump administration.
And what are the biggest issues of human rights around the world that you care about today that like take up space in your mind?
Well, I would say injustices. And the dictatorships around the world, like in North Korea, the Soviet Union, and all the countries that are under repression in Eastern Europe, all that is affecting the environment, the whole world. So there are so many injustices, even toward South America, Central America. So right now the world is going through, in a way, a turmoil. There were a lot of idealistic people that are trying to correct the situation. But there is a lack of social and moral principles worldwide. And hopefully there's a new trend now with the Biden administration that social justice will start prevailing again in the USA.
And what do you think the role of faith can be in combating human rights abuses worldwide?
Well, faith is very important because without faith, you become an unbeliever. And if you become an unbeliever, then you don't trust other people, you don't trust the government, and you kind of lose hope for the future. So faith helps you to have hope. And I would say all religions, the Jewish people, the Episcopalians, I don't like the word Protestant, uh, the Lutherans, they all have the same ideals. So if we work together, at least within the United States, we would create a better environment of respect to all generations, the young people, the students, the career people, the elderly, and mainly to eliminate the racial injustices.
Have you ever read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
Yes.
When did you read it?
I would say when I was in college in Atlanta, I was a senior at the University of Cuba, but once you transfer to the US, you lose a lot of credits. So I remember I had to take, even though I was considered like a junior, even though I was a senior in Cuba, then I had to take some subjects from sophomore year and perhaps freshman that were required subjects that were not part of the curriculum of junior and senior. So the most interesting that had an impact on me was American history. And I really was inspired by the American history.
That's wonderful. Did I forget to ask you any other important questions, or is there anything else you want to add about your ideas of human rights?
Well, I would say we have to be conscious that human rights are for everybody. It's part of what God wanted for all human beings. So we cannot promote human rights for certain groups and not for other groups. We have to be united in faith and in hope.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Ay, qué cute. Ay, you're so wonderful. Okay.